Never heard of the guy, right? I mean, that's how great Walter was. This is going to be, I think, a really interesting ball game. Teams fighting for legacy and history, and other teams validating the great wins that they have. Okay, enough of me here. I can't wait to hear Marcus Hayes and how he sees this game, because here it is. You know, history does sometimes repeat itself. The Patriots and Brady beat McNabb and Reid in 2004. Then they turn around and lose to Brady and Belichick in 2017. You lose in 2022 to Mahomes and Reid. Now you have a shot at validating and vindicating. Let's get Marcus Hayes in here and get his thoughts on how he sees this game. I think it's one of the most intriguing football games, and you would have to make the argument. I mean, I guess if you looked at the Kansas City numbers right now, Marcus, you don't think that they really had a great year, but then you look up at the one-loss column. Hang on, they're 15-2. I mean, hey, so much. If we bang on Jalen for having 2903 in passing yards, someone's going to go, Sills, yeah, I know. What's his name only had 3,900 something too, but they're 15-2. And here both quarterbacks are. How do you see this thing in this matchup in 10 days from now in New Orleans?
Well, the 15-2 to me completely validates the argument that the quarterback win is a stat, because Patrick Mahomes has made so many key plays down the stretches and played such smart football that the passer rating, yards, touchdowns, interception percentage, yards per attempt, all of those metrics are wonderful, and I use them all. But the most, and it's funny, we have a generation of young reporters and people who dismiss the quarterback win or the pitcher win. No one has a greater influence on winning or losing a game than a quarterback or a starting pitcher. So it certainly should be a stat. Now, you can have quarterbacks that get wins sort of despite themselves, or they're coincidental to wins, but not over a long period of time. And especially as they get older. As they get older, they're not going to be given more chances to fail if they're mediocre. So these guys with, so many wins, whether it's baseball or football, the win really does matter. The win stat is really relevant to those players. And maybe no player it doesn't matter to any player as much as Patrick Mahomes, who's, I think we're playing in a diluted time right now. When people talk about the greatest teams of all time, they're all pre-free agency. Because before free agency, you didn't have the capacity to leave. So those 49ers teams were just ridiculous. Those Dolphins teams, those Steelers teams were just ridiculous, right?
Yeah.
Multiple Hall of Famers. How many Hall of Famers were on the 2017 Eagles team? You know what I'm saying? So maybe one in Jason Kelce, maybe two with Lane Johnson. Forgive me if I'm forgetting someone. But to answer your question, if Patrick Mahomes exists, and he's not even fully healthy because he beat him on a bad ankle last time, if Patrick Mahomes exists, we're seeing the greatest quarterback of all time. Now, I think Aaron Rodgers is the greatest passer of all time. I happen to think that Joe Montana is probably the greatest all-around, winner, understanding things quarterback of all time, even better than Peyton Manning, and a spectacular athlete, not a great arm. And, Tom Brady understood and evolved into the most prolific quarterback of all time. But Patrick Mahomes is the best. He's just the best. He does crazy stuff. He's innovative. He throws off 7 different platforms. It's just so much fun to watch him. So, it's hard to bet against him, isn't it?
Yeah, completely. I mean, every time I do, I'm like, there he is again. You're talking about he's in his 5th Super Bowl now. I believe only Elway and Brady match that number where they've been in 5 Super Bowl starts. I mean, it's been just remarkable. And I'll throw this, since you throw Montana out there, would you not agree that maybe Andy Reid and Patrick Mahomes are the greatest, head coach, play caller, quarterback combination in Super Bowl era history? I mean,
No,
I know Joe's got 4, so we're there though.
I think Walsh and Montana, like because the rules have changed.
Yep.
And Patrick Mahomes, not only is he protected, he abuses the protection. Joe Montana wasn't protected,
No.
and neither were his receivers or his tight ends, And so, no, I think that, and what they did with that West Coast offense, and I understand it was like a normal evolution of offense. It's not like Bill Walsh woke up one day and said, "Hey, I'm going to throw 8-yard passes forever." What they did was more innovative in a much more difficult era to win, though they did it with players they controlled more,
Yeah.
And honestly, like what Brady and Belichick did over such a long period of time is just astonishing, and I think that football is worse right now than it was 15 years ago and 30 years ago. So, no, I don't think they should be considered the best duo of all time. But I was talking to another colleague earlier on his show. These things are kind of like, it's not their fault,
No.
And if they played in 1984 or 2004, maybe they would have been, you're not comparing apples to apples because, I mean, I was listening. I'm a huge Isaiah Thomas fan, and I see him on social media sometimes, those reels that pop up or TikToks or whatever. And, they ask him, would you have been good today? He's like, no, I'd have been spectacular today. I'd have been the best player in the league today because the rules change. And the rules change from Montana to Brady. Because of Brady, Patrick Mahomes has all of these rules. So I wouldn't say that they've done it long enough to be as good as Belichick and Brady. And I wouldn't say they did it as well as Walsh and Montana, who were really innovating.
What's going to be different this time from Super Bowl 57 to Super Bowl 59 for the Eagles, facing pretty much Spagnuolo, Mahomes, Andy Reid again? In your eyes, what's going to be different in the outcome in this game versus in 57?
Not a lot. It's very similar, right? I mean, you had the same 2 great receivers. You had, a great coach, a great head coach, and a great quarterback, and a great defensive coordinator in Spagnuolo, who's gotten, the credit he deserves since then. But the big difference is Saquon Barkley. I mean, I'm not a cheerleader, you know that.
Yeah, completely.
But one of the things I've been able to do, and I'll tell you a funny story where my biggest miss ever, but one of the things I've been able to do is appreciate greatness in the moment, right? So, and sort of objectively analyze teams. So in 2017, when Nick Foles got hurt, or when Carson Wentz got hurt, I looked at the team and I said, Carson Wentz is coincidental to this team's success. You need a good quarterback, not a great one. And the day after Carson Wentz got hurt, when people were literally sobbing on the radio, I was like, don't sweat it. This team is better than this team isn't where it is because of Carson Wentz. Wow. This team is where it is coincidental to Carson Wentz. Not that he's bad, but he's good. But the other guy, I saw him win 12 games one year. Yep. So he can help you in a short term, especially if you protect him. So I said that to say what we're seeing right now is not only the best season any Eagle has ever had, and it's not close. And trust me, Reggie in the late 80s, Terrell Owens in 2004, Bednarik in the 50s and 60s. This guy plays arguably the second hardest, if not the hardest position. It's certainly the hardest position to be prolific in this era of football. And he is by far the best we've seen maybe ever. You saw OJ play, and Jim Brown. You saw those guys play. And every time the ball was snapped, you knew where it was going. So those guys, yeah, okay, I'll give them, maybe they would do the same or better as Saquon Barkley. And, maybe
those are crazy players you're mentioning, though.
This is my Rushmore. It's OJ, Jim Brown, Walter Payton, and Barry Sanders, right?
Sure,
those are my 4 guys.
Yes.
Saquon is having a better season from my perspective than Barry Sanders or Walter Payton ever had.
Yeah.
Like Walter, he's the best player on a Super Bowl team that is better known for its defense and whose quarterback is marginalized. That's a really weird parallel.
So when you look at him, because you've referenced this to me before, you think that 04 roster was as good as it gets for the Eagles, and you like that roster. You think that Barkley has made more of an impact on this team than what Owens did, even though, again, he got hurt. I believe in week 12, he had 1,400 yards, I think 14 TDs in 12 ball games, and then went out there with one wheel and had a hell of a Super Bowl in that Super Bowl against the Patriots. But you think Barkley's made more of an impact than what Owens did, non-quarterback wise, when you're looking at two players like that, a running back and wide receiver?
Yeah, I mean, he's having one of the best seasons in the history of football, not in the history of Philadelphia, but in the history of football, in an era where he's not allowed to do it. Yeah. You know, well, and here's the other thing we should appreciate. How good has Derrick Henry been?
He had 1937 this year.
Right. And he's just so good, and everybody knows he's going to get it. And he's got like a third gear, and he's, you know, bigger than a linebacker. So watching these two guys play right now is kind of like watching, you know, Jerry Rice and Randy Moss play at the same time.
What's different, in your opinion, from Andy Reid Philly, Andy Reid Kansas City? Is it just simply Mahomes?
No, it's humility and delegation.
Huh.
Yeah. So I actually went there the first year that he coached. I think they started like 7-0, 8-0, something like that. The first year he coached there, I went there to do a story actually on Andrew Wiggins, who was a freshman at Kansas and a teammate of a guy named Joel Embiid.
Yes.
So I went there to do an Andy Reid story and went to a Kansas game and saw those two guys play as well, which is funny because, you know, whisper down the lane, maybe the most significant person among them is Joel Embiid, right? He wasn't even starting for Kansas at that point. So anyway, the big takeaway I had just a few months removed from Andy leaving Philadelphia, and I covered Andy every second. I went to Andy Reid's house the day he got hired. I went to Green Bay the day he got hired in Philadelphia. So
is it true, Marcus, that everybody in Philly went Andy who?
Nobody hired? Well, no, that's not. Well, not everybody. The football seam heads, the people who really followed football, knew exactly where he was because Jeffrey Lurie tried to hire him twice as the offensive coordinator, and back then you could protect one assistant coach from going somewhere with a promotion. So Holmgren protected Andy. He wouldn't let him interview for the offensive coordinator job to replace John Gruden. So we got Dana Bible instead. So. So anyway, the big change I noticed in Andy right away is he was much more comfortable in his own skin, and he was much more comfortable letting the players sort of be the players, and he was much more comfortable letting his assistant coaches have a voice and power. You understand what I'm saying?
Yep.
What's the first? Do you remember? Were you here when Andy came in 1999? The most remarkable thing he did for years. Do you remember what it was? He made George Hegeman. So George Hegeman was demoted from starter to backup. Got in his car, I think in his pads and cleats, and left the facility. Came back later after he talked to his agent. Andy welcomed him back and made him push a blocking sled up and down the field for half an hour while everybody else watched. Right?
Okay.
So a guy named, I think it was Bill Lyon from the Inquirer, called him Captain Andy after Captain Bligh from what was that?
Treasure Island?
No, Mutiny on the Bounty.
That's it.
Right? It was just a horrible thing to do to any person.
Captain Bligh.
And so like fast forward 13, 14 years, whatever it was, that guy was gone. That guy had learned. I mean, he'd lost a son the year before. Jeffrey Lurie really, really wanted to keep him and had kept him a couple of times when there was pressure to get rid of him. And I don't want to say he was humbled necessarily, but he had greater perspective and was much more secure in himself And I think that's been the big, like Andy Reid doing a State Farm commercial, stealing Patrick Mahomes' chicken nuggets. That would have never happened here. And I don't think it would have happened had he stayed here. You know, and he's always had a very good sense of humor. He's always been a very intelligent, very curious guy, but he couldn't let anybody see that. And now he does, you know, now he has. So that's the biggest difference for me. And it's been very consistent in Kansas City. Like, it's been very, very consistent that, and, you know, it was a different atmosphere there too.
Yeah.
He goes to Kansas City where, you know, it's a blue blood organization with a blue blood ownership group and family. And it's by far the biggest thing in town, unless the Royals are in the World Series. And it's the Midwest. Things are different. And I think Andy's more comfortable with all of that compared with when he was here. Jeffrey Lurie and Joe Banner were still sort of seen as imposters, interlopers, carpetbaggers who couldn't win, who wouldn't spend money. You know, Joe Banner didn't have a very good forward-facing public personality, even though he's maybe one of the best vice presidents in the history of the NFL. All that said, you know, it was hard for him to relax here. Plus, he was a really big guy from Salt Lake and Green Bay, but raised in Compton, believe it or not, in Los Angeles. But, you know, it was very awkward and difficult place for him to be relaxed. Kansas City is much more, it's much easier for him to sort of be himself there. And, you know, I'm glad for him, but I don't think it could have happened here.
The slower pace probably of the Midwest probably fits him better than what the fast pace of Philadelphia and the East Coast probably is. And he, like you said, he looks more at ease here. I had a conversation. I want to lead you here now, Marcus. Mm-hmm. I've known Frank Reich for over 40 years. I told you, I believe this before. We were teammates when I was at Maryland my freshman year before I transferred to Miami. And we were there, and we've been friends. He's been on our program numerous times when he was the head coach of the Colts. Actually, Jeffrey Lurie, he said on this program, called him, and it was Frank who recommended Nick Sirianni to the Eagles.
Right,
and,
yeah.
I mean, that's how he told them how to operate. There's a political way of doing things in Philly. If you want to be the head coach, he said Doug couldn't handle it. I mean, and that's kind of what the maneuvering has been. So I talked to him. If Kellen Moore gets that job, and on January 30th, Marcus, you know the NFL is like the waves in the ocean. It changes every second. If he gets that job, Frank told me that the Eagles have contacted him. Now, they haven't offered him, but they contacted him. Now, the relationship goes back when I was covering the Chargers. Obviously, Nick was his wide receiver coach when he was the OC. In San Diego. He was also in Indianapolis with him. In your opinion, would that be a good hire for the offense? A bad hire? I know that Josh McCown, the quarterback coach up in Minnesota, is also potentially in the conversation. Nussmeier, they might elevate within like they did a year ago. How do you see that whole thing transpiring if indeed Kellen gets that job in New Orleans?
I would be very surprised if McCown is a real candidate. We'll go backwards. I don't know how it would work for the employee to be the boss and the boss to be the employee if Reich comes and works with Nick. And I don't think it's the Reich issue. Reich is he's one of the best people I've ever been around. I covered him when he was a backup for the Bills, and he's exactly the same guy 35 years later as he was in 1990 through 93.
And Marcus, he's still making David Tepper money right now. The same dynamic that's going on with Kingsbury in Washington. The Bidwell money is still being, there's a compensation of that. Right. So, you're not in really any hurry if you're Cliff to go anywhere and take a gig if you're not comfortable with the environment that you think that organization has. So I think that could be a dynamic too in that whole process. So, I mean, I know both of them, Frank and Nick, love one another. I know there's a great affiliation. There's a great affection for both of them.
But it's also very difficult. And this may not make perfect logical sense on the face of it. Jeffrey Lurie loves Frank Reich.
Yep.
Like, he's probably the person he respects the most as a person in the NFL. So if things go sideways, all of a sudden you've got a very easy replacement and a big shadow. Frank Reich wasn't horrible in Indianapolis, and he was, sort of the offensive brain behind Carson Wentz's ascension and a Super Bowl win, right?
Yeah.
So it's a big shadow. But I do know this. Nick Sirianni cannot endorse Nussmeier more. Every chance he gets, he's like, hey, this is Doug Nussmeier. There's a big reason for our success this year. So I get the impression, I've gotten the impression over the last 6 weeks or so that Nick has anticipated the possible departure of Kellen, and he's lobbying for Nussmeier whenever he can. That doesn't mean Nussmeier's going to get the job, but it might be very awkward if he doesn't get the job. If you remember, I think it was Denard Wilson was the defensive backs coach the Super Bowl year.
Yep.
And everybody thought he would just take over for Gannon as defensive coordinator. Not only did he not take over for Gannon, Nick fired him.
Yeah.
How do you fire a defensive backs coach that what you went to the Super Bowl with,
Right.
But I think the being comfortable in the office is very, very important to Nick. So if they win the Super Bowl, it's a different conversation if they lose. But if they win the Super Bowl and you've got Super Bowl winning assistant coaches on your staff, it's very difficult to argue against Nick being able to hire whoever he wants, because Nick is entering the last year of his contract, and maybe he coaches as a lame duck and goes somewhere else and gets bigger money. How badly do you want to keep Nick? Does it become a power struggle between Nick versus Howie and Jeffrey if they differ on who should be the offensive coordinator, assuming Kellen goes to New Orleans?
Couple more here for you, Marcus. You tell me how you see Kellen Moore. I said this about him, and there's no coincidence. He was up for the Cowboy job, and now he's the front runner to get the New Orleans job. They're in the Super Bowl. He's done something completely different than what he did in Dallas. He had the number 1 ranked offenses in Dallas. They couldn't get out of the opening rounds, or they couldn't get to a conference championship game. And here what he does, he goes into the bye, and he absolutely reinvents the entire offense, because let's be candid here. The way that team was constructed was not the way they wanted to win. You got $50 million of wideouts out there. You got a $15 million tight end. You got a $50 million quarterback. And the guy you bring in from New York is not supposed to be the centerpiece of that football team. So all that being said, he looked at it like this. Well, we're going to take the football out of the hands of Hurts. We're going to put the football more in the hands of Barkley. I think what he did was he went with the best guy in the huddle and said, that guy's going to carry us more. I'm not saying Jalen wasn't important to the 2000 rushing season because he's the one-off. He is. He wouldn't have got $2,000 without Hurts being in that huddle. I know that. But the passing game suffered. If you're an owner and you see Hurts' numbers down at 29.03 and 18 touchdowns, how are you looking at that and saying, that's the guy who's going to help my quarterback get better? When if you look at it on the optics, the quarterback didn't get better statistically in Philadelphia. They took the ball away from him, but he did the most important thing that Jimmy Johnson said. He won ball games. Developing a quarterback and winning games. How do you hire that? I mean, how do you dissect this?
Well, you're assuming that there's more quarterback to develop. You're assuming that Jalen Hurts is better than what we're seeing potentially. Maybe he's not. Maybe he's just what he is. I was on an earlier radio show, and the question was, is he a top 10 quarterback? And I was like, you can argue yes and you can argue no, but I would argue that, it's irrelevant. He's a quarterback that fits his system, and he's a winning quarterback almost everywhere he's been. I mean, except for the end of last year, Jalen Hurts has been an absolute winner, doing whatever it takes. Now, maybe we're seeing the ceiling, 250 here, 290 there, no 300-yard games. But do you really have to have that when not only do you have great weapons around him, you've got great weapons around him locked down for at least the next 2 seasons, both wide receivers. the running back, all the offensive linemen. I mean, there's no reason Saquon can't get 2,000 again. There's no reason they can't ride the offense to the Super Bowl if the defense falters. This is a really good team. So I don't think you can blame Kellen Moore for not, I guess, for not maximizing Jalen Hurts or improving Jalen Hurts. Maybe Jalen Hurts is what he is. Jalen Hurts had 103 passer rating this year. That's the best in his career, right? So he's asked his player to do what he can do instead of what he can't do, and that's the mark of a great coach. Now, very different conversation, okay? Does that mean he's going to be a good head coach? All it means from my perspective is that as a very young coach, he took a really good offensive line, a really good quarterback, a great running back in Dallas, and achieved to a certain degree. Went to San Diego, or went to the Chargers for a year, then comes here and he does the same thing. So all he has proven to me is that he understands how to use the materials in front of him. None of that indicates he's going to be a great head coach, right?
No.
And I've been around a lot of guys who, and I've been wrong too, but guys who've gotten head coaching jobs and guys who've succeeded and failed. I thought John Gruden would absolutely be a great head coach. Absolutely. I didn't think Doug Peterson would ever be a coach in the NFL, when he was doing his internship. So I was wrong about Doug, who's a pretty good offensive mind and an okay head coach, and comes and goes. Not the most invested guy, but successful, right? I've been around Kellen Moore off and on for probably 4 or 5 years because I was embedded in Dallas a couple of times. I have never gotten the impression that he's going to be the kind of person you need as a head coach, especially a head coach who's doing rebuilding and teaching and setting up a culture and changing a culture. I've never gotten that impression. When Andy Reid was a quarterback's coach in Green Bay, I covered those Super Bowls. I thought Andy Reid would be a great head coach. I wasn't sure he'd be a great offensive coordinator, a schemer, but he just had that sort of aura about him. So again, to answer your first question, I wouldn't blame Kellen Moore for Jalen Hurts not producing the way he did in 2022 or not becoming, more like Lamar Jackson, who, or Russell Wilson, a young Russell Wilson. Those are the comps, right? Yep. I wouldn't blame him for that. There's a reason Jalen Hurts was a second-round pick, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean I'm endorsing him as anybody's head coach. This might be Kellen Moore's ceiling. We talk about Jalen Hurts' ceiling. This might be Kellen's ceiling. And there's nothing wrong with that. Steve Spagnuolo, clearly his ceiling is, being a defensive coordinator. Jim Johnson knew it. Vic Fangio knows it. There's nothing wrong with that.
No, absolutely. I mean, Spagnuolo, you mentioned 4 titles. Josh McDaniel, 6 Super Bowl titles as a coordinator up in New England. Put him in at the head job. He ain't the guy.
It's a hard job. It's really hard. I mean, you're responsible for everything above you and below you as a head football coach. There's no other job like that.
Do you think now again, I'm going to play once again, shock jock here for you. And I want you, because you always do, you put me in my place here when I need to be. So when I heard this comment, the coaches finally took the straitjacket off me. Here's, me. That's like lighting a trash can on fire. Okay.
Let me tell you. So I'm sitting probably, 20 feet away from Jalen, 25 feet away from Jalen. And I have this app on my phone. It's called Otter, right? And it'll not only records it, it transcribes it badly, but it transcribes it. When he said that, I had to look at the transcription and make sure I heard it right. And there's a guy named Ed Kratz, who you might have had on your show, who writes for SI.com.
Yeah.
And he just went and Ed is he's a pretty chill guy like that. And he tried to ask Jalen 2 questions later. When you say straitjacket and another guy was asking a question with him, I think it was Jeff McClain was asking a different question. Jalen said, I'm going to answer this question. He totally avoided, it was Ed's turn. Jeff had asked a couple questions already. He totally avoided Ed knowing what Ed was going to ask and why he was going to ask it. So please continue.
Okay. So as I light the trash can on fire with Marcus Hayes here, I will do that. So when I heard it, I was like, come again? And I was the same thing. I go, so I played it back. I went, is this guy taking a shit on the coaches when he's doing this? I mean, is he absolutely going, well, finally I get a chance to sprout my wings and show what I can do too. This is not just the Saquon Barkley show. And I felt a little AJ. AJ goes, well, hey, we just want to win. We're doing this. But I got a feeling in that huddle, there's been some hard conversations made to AJ and both Hurts that we're going to win this game, and you guys don't like the way we're winning. They'll address this in the offseason. But, Marcus, I think a lot of people in that huddle have come to understand and accept their roles that they don't want to accept only because they're in Super Bowl 59. But I thought that was a shot at the coaching staff's approach. Did you take it that way?
I thought it was self-defense. I don't think he was criticizing coaching and I wrote this today. I actually wrote about, because it's a hell of a thing to say, right? And so this week, access to the players is relatively limited, and access to like the locker room is restricted to local people. I don't know that Jalen will have to address this as much this week as he will next week, when all
media day,
no holds barred, right? So the reason I wrote what I wrote, and this is what I wrote, like, it sounds like there's another big trash can fire here, but there's not. Jalen is defending Jalen more than he's criticizing the coaches. If you remember, like in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, Donovan McNabb was being criticized for not running enough.
Yep.
By the local president of the NAACP chapter of all people. He's ashamed of being a black quarterback. He doesn't want to run. So Donovan was very
way.
sensitive.
No, they didn't. They didn't. No way.
Look it up.
No.
Look it up. Look it up.
God.
It's crazy. I think his name is Mondesire. Okay. So Donovan was very sensitive to being cast as a run-only quarterback. That's why he went to Syracuse. They were running that scheme, but he had such a great arm. He did such a good job at the Senior Bowl under John Gruden, who was the Raiders coach back then, and coached him at the Senior Bowl. The Eagles just were floored by his arm strength. Now, Donovan never turned into, Dan Marino or Aaron Rodgers or whoever, but he's a very good quarterback with a great arm.
Absolutely.
Now, fast forward 20 years, we have a similar situation. And Jalen doesn't want to be cast as a 195-yard game manager who does the tush push because he can squat 550. He wants to be respected as a passer. Now, there's a reality here, two realities. The reality is he's probably more capable of doing more as a passer, but the coaching staff understands that it's less risky to throw certain passes, take certain routes away, certain options away, and give the ball to Saquon. Mainly because now the best player on a team might be A.J. Brown, if it's not Saquon. The most important player on the team is Jalen. So why not use those two guys more? Because it's really close between those two guys or those three guys and your three best offensive linemen. So you're using more tools in a safer strategy. Okay, so that's one reality. Okay, the other reality for me is you don't hear Jalen Hurts quote Nick Sirianni very much, but you hear him quote Nick Saban all the time.
Yeah,
which to me is a great indicator of who he respects more. And there's nothing wrong with respecting Nick Saban more than Nick Sirianni or Saint Nick. I mean, Nick Saban is a spectacular, he's one of the most successful people to ever do a job in the history of doing jobs, right? And Jalen was a much more impressionable person and a very kind of a complete person when he arrived here. And, let's face it, Nick Sirianni is hard to take seriously sometimes.
Oh, yeah.
But there isn't any disrespect from Jalen to Nick. He's a respectful employee. And the contrast is that Sirianni goes overboard and is very careful not to criticize Jalen and defends Jalen and hypes Jalen. At one point, he was like, yeah, Jalen should be in the MVP conversation too. He actually said those words because look at all the games he's won. And I'm like, yeah, but, the other guys are doing quarterback stuff. You know,
Oh,
so
wow.
you know we can't. It's almost like patting somebody on the head.
Yeah.
It's not almost condescending praise. You
It's
know,
not genuine.
right? It can't be taken seriously. So
Right.
if you're Jalen and you're hearing that, you're like, oh, geez. So anyway, my point is their relationship is bigger than that comment. I think their relationship is better now than it was this time last year, in part because Jalen had never lost like that before. And he knew he wasn't doing his job well. He knew Nick wasn't doing his job well. And he didn't endorse him after the loss to Tampa Bay, and again didn't endorse him after OTAs, right? But I think their relationship has matured to the degree that comment isn't necessarily a shot at the coaches as much as it's Jalen defending himself and trying to express, I can still do this, or I can do this whenever I need to.
Finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you. I don't know if you're going to lean right now either way because it's kind of early. We're 10 days out from it. But how about if you're leaning right now? Who do you like in this game in 10 days right now? Do you like the Chiefs, or do you think the Eagles right now have a chance to vindicate what happened a couple years ago?
No, the Eagles are both the quarterback and the coach are better today than they were 2 years ago. And maybe Mahomes and Reid are too, but it's hard to be better than great, right? And the Eagles have a much better roster. They have more good players, especially on offense. The secret sauce for Spagnuolo is confusing opposing quarterbacks. But if the opposing quarterback's only going to drop back 18 to 20 times, a lot of that advantage goes away. You know, I hate to like hedge it a little bit because of the health of Cam Jurgens, the center, and Landon Dickerson, the left guard, really does matter because that's where the biggest advantage is. And I know Kansas City's got a great defense, independent of Spagnuolo. Any defensive coordinator would be proud to be running this defense. But yeah, they're probably a touchdown better than Kansas City on a neutral field with everybody healthy, or as healthy as they can be. Yeah, it's a really this is by far the best Eagles roster I've ever seen. You know, it's you've got a potential Hall of Fame left tackle, a potential Hall of Fame left guard, a probable Hall of Fame right tackle, a probable Hall of Fame running back, a probable Hall of Fame wide receiver. You know, that's ridiculous. That's like those old Dolphins and Kansas City or San Francisco 49ers teams. And the other side of the ball, you've got so many good young players, such great chemistry, such depth, and Jalen Carter. My contention has always been, if you have a defensive tackle who can make an impact on about 25 to 35% of his snaps, and if he can take 75% of them, that's just a huge advantage. And, you know, from Warren Sapp to I can't remember the guy's name. There's a big, just giant guy named Ted from the
Washington.
Bills. Yes, Ted Washington. You know, those are the people that I saw. I think it might have been Gruden when I was covering the Eagles back in the 90s. He said, "Listen, if you want to watch," we were talking about something. They had not great offensive lines then. So if you want to watch something, watch the right guard play in these offenses, in the West Coast offense. What the right guard does is sort of indicative, because it's usually like a smaller guy who's agile, who does a lot of pulling, double teaming. If you watch the right guard, then the right guard will, that person, wherever he goes, the ball's going to go, and you can see everything else peripherally. Like, you don't have to stare at the quarterback or the running back. Watch the right guard. You'll see blocks open up, that sort of thing. So to me, it's just so important that this offensive line of the Eagles is healthy, because honestly, that's probably their biggest advantage. They've got absolute studs on the offensive line. Their biggest, meanest offense, or second biggest, meanest offensive lineman is their worst, Mekhi Becton. You know, it's just, it's such a huge benefit. And if Dallas Goedert is right, they've got 6 great offensive line. So yeah, I like the Eagles by a touchdown.
Okay, I have to sneak one last one in on you because Angelo said it too to me on Monday. Hey, man, if Jeffrey Lurie buys the Celtics, of all teams, the Celtics, I mean, wow, Boston, Philly, I mean, that's kind of like oil and water, you know, those two places. I mean, boy, I'll tell you, man. I mean, now I know why he sold a percentage of the team, because he wanted to get in the mix here of being a guy to buy it. And I see what Josh Harris does. You know, he's now didn't want to really congratulate the Eagles on winning the NFC Championship with the Sixers and their social media. How do you take that if Lurie does end up? I know he's a New England guy and he's always coveted one of those teams up there. I mean, how do you see him buy? I mean, Jeffrey Lurie, Eagles, and owns the Celtics. I don't know. I mean, it feels like I'm cheating on my wife.
Well, there's two things. For all the good he's done in Philadelphia, and this goes for me too. If you're not from here, you're not a Philadelphian. I've been here for 30 years, and people still treat me like a newcomer or an outcast. And I don't blame them. You know, I don't see things in a very Philadelphian way. Neither does Jeffrey, you know. So I think that sort of modulates the outrage. Like if Middleton were to buy the Celtics, I think people would be, or David Montgomery had, you know, been interested in buying the Celtics, or somebody like that who was more ingrained in the community, I think it'd be a bigger deal. Number one. Number two, you guys are really showing your age. Like the only team I cared about growing up, and I didn't grow up here. I grew up in northern New York, like near Canada. The only team I cared about was the Philadelphia 76ers. The only person I've ever been nervous, Tiger, Michael Jordan, Shaq, Dr. J. I mean, Julius Erving was such, and remains absolutely regal. Right?
Oh my God, Marcus, I know why you and I, because when I grew up, I was an ABA guy. I hated the Knicks. And all I remember was that giant afro taken off from the top of the key, him in that red, white, and blue Nets jersey, man, wearing 32. I got
the red, white, and blue ball
on my wall, palming the basketball. I met him when I was in Orlando, and I'm like, he's the only guy I've ever done this. That's Dr. J.
Right.
I know. I'm like, no, you don't know.
Yeah, he's absolutely regal, like all the time. So anyway, let me preface this by saying that, number one. Number two, the only team I've ever hated, like actually hated, thought the refs cheated for, thought they were cheats and bad people, was the Boston Celtics. And I can't express the degree of hatred I had for the Boston Celtics. My basketball was huge for us, and I was the point guard on the varsity team for a couple of years, right?
Yeah.
I was the guy. I was that guy. It was like Hoosiers, but I was the guy. Our colors were green and gold and white. I bought red, and we had green and gold and white team shoes. I bought red ones, white and red with a red chevron and star, because that's what Doc wore. My coach was so angry, right? It cost me like $15 extra because as a team, you get a break, right?
Yeah.
So that said, we are of the same era and sort of generation and investment in the NBA. The NBA no longer exists.
Yeah.
It doesn't exist. It's just players. You know, people don't remember the teams Paul George played for. You know, people don't remember where Kevin Durant began his career, or James Harden for that matter.
You think LeBron ruined the NBA?
No, it wasn't just LeBron. It was actually Kevin Garnett. I mean, that was the first dream team.
The original dream
team.
team. Actually, maybe even Barkley. Maybe even Barkley in that team in Houston.
Maybe. But the first assembled team, sort of like artificially assembled team was Doc Rivers in Boston, right?
Yep.
But no, I don't think it's a ruination. It is what it is. You know, you should play where you want, and play for the highest bidder and have a good time. It's about you. But to your point, no, I don't think Jeffrey Lurie would get a whole lot of grief for buying or being a part of the group that bought the Boston Celtics. For one thing, nobody really cares about basketball anymore in general. And it looks like the Sixers are going to miss their window of relevance. By the time the Sixers are relevant again, like really relevant, Jeffrey probably isn't going to be running any team. You know, he's probably going to be past that part of his life. I mean, it's another, 10, 12 years? You know, what's Jeffrey, 65, 67, something like that?
You don't think the Sixers are going to be relevant in the next decade?
Well, unless you think Joel Embiid is going to make them relevant again, then you have to rebuild around Tyrese Maxey and whoever else. And it's very specious. I mean, and nobody wants to play here. Nobody wants to come here. You know, Paul George only came because there was a fourth year. right? They were the only one offering a 4th year. And that's not, I'm not, ripping the Sixers or whatever. It's just, it is what it is. So I don't think that the Sixers are relevant enough. And I don't think that there's a rivalry with Boston enough anymore to make it that big a deal. Number one. Number two, the guy who owns the Sixers owns the Commanders and the Devils.
Yeah.
So you can go watch the Commanders play the Eagles and the Flyers play the Devils in your car. And Josh Harris is going to be in the stands, So I just don't think it's that big a deal anymore. But that's for us, for the generation behind us. If you're 45 or younger, I don't think you really care the way that you used to care. I think the only team that you couldn't own in Philadelphia is the Dallas Cowboys.
Marcus, absolutely great stuff. Thank you so much for doing this. I appreciate it, man. I can't wait to see Super Bowl 59. I mean, you should have seen the videos I got. Sileo, I'm hammered in Center City. I'm getting all the videos of me. So this is like the first I've seen this stuff. Look at me. I'm going like, holy cow. Just imagine if they win this thing in New Orleans. Pretty good crowd too, right? Kansas City fan base, and you got Eagle fan base in New Orleans.
Well, I'll tell you, I would be very surprised to see a lot of Kansas City people there. It's expensive to go to the Super Bowl.
It is. And
they've gone to the last two. And the last one, I think, was in Vegas.
Yes.
So it's really, really, honestly, I know a lot of Patriots fans, you kind of get Super Bowl fatigue. It's not a great thing to go to as a fan. You don't have a lot of access. There's not a lot to do. There's the city's kind of empty, and you don't get to go to the parties everybody talks about. You don't really get to see anybody. I think probably the most fun Super Bowl for fans that I've been to is the Dan Reeves Atlanta Falcons Super Bowl in Miami.
Okay.
That one was really a great opportunity for and it was like Miami Beach and this and that and the third. But I've been to Tampa Super Bowls, San Diego Super Bowls, Minneapolis Super Bowls.
Don't tell me you were on the boat in Jacksonville, because that was the shittiest Super Bowl.
I was lucky because it was the reporters from the teams that were in the Super Bowl got to stay in actual hotels. It was far away from everything. I think we were at like one of the golf resorts or something, but it was not optimal, but it wasn't a cruise ship. But I don't know that Kansas City is going to be as well represented this time, even though they're shooting for history, because it's expensive and it's kind of boring.
I tell people all the time, and it sounds so conceited. I've been to 15 of these things, and believe me, I think they're overrated. I mean, just to go around and sitting there at a convention going, I feel like I'm at like one of those Aaron Rodgers pot smoking conventions. I'm sitting around going, hey, everybody, how you doing? I'm like, okay, well, that's not why I wanted to come here. But anyway, Marcus, thank you so much, my friend. Make sure you check his column out on the Philadelphia Inquirer. I'll be reading that today. I always read you. And thank you so much, Marcus. I appreciate your time, my friend.
My pleasure. Let me know if you need me in the future.
You bet. That is our friend, Marcus Hayes. I really love talking with him. Absolutely sensational stuff. Make sure you guys check out his website. By the way, right around the corner at the bottom of the hour, we're scheduled to get Howard Eskin. Also, do not forget our great friends have now become part of the program at Morgan & Morgan. I've been friends with John Morgan for over 20 years, folks. His law firm was established to make sure you and your family are protected. Morgan & Morgan is America's #1 injury law firm in America, with over $20 billion recovered for the clients. I mean, folks, this is why this firm was built, for making sure they defend families and people like you. Okay, Morgan & Morgan has been around for plus 25 years. I've known John and watched the law firm grow. Here in Pennsylvania, there was a client that was awarded $26 million. And this is after the initial company, the insurance company, offered $650K. They went in there and got that guy $26 million. Or how about in Florida, a client got $12 million in recovery. And this is after the insurance company only offered $350,000. Look, life is tough. We all know that. Morgan & Morgan will be the easiest decision you make for you and your family. If you're ever injured, Check out Morgan & Morgan. The fee is free. They have to win for everybody to get paid. Simple as that. For more information, do me a favor. Go to forthepeople.com/big sales or pound 529. That's FOR thepeople.com/big sales or pound 529. Folks, this is the best decision you'll make. And do me a favor, you tell them Big Sills sent you.
This is Eric. When he got injured in a car accident, he called Morgan & Morgan. He not only gets a lawyer, he gets trial lawyers like Sam and Jessica who are in it to win it. He gets his own investigators with briefcases, leather ones. And if you ever have questions, our customer service folks keep things rolling. Injured? We're your army. Morgan & Morgan, America's largest injury law firm.
If you missed any of today's show on the JAKIB Media channel, listen to the podcast on your way home. Available on YouTube, Apple, and Spotify.
Ignite your nights with